Good morning. Now, in these weeks following Easter, as is normal for the weeks following Easter, we've been looking at the early church. The resurrection led inexorably and inevitably to the growth of a new community. And that's what Jesus had always planned. That's what he prayed for. We started by thinking about how God gives the abundance of everything that the church needs. And then we looked at how we need to be witnesses. And we heard that again today, didn't we, in the Gospel reading. I am the vine, you are the branches, said Jesus, and he sends us out as witnesses. Then last week we heard about how the Christian community must inevitably be local. Although we may think globally, even cosmically, our calling, our mission is always rooted in the local. Today, we're going to be thinking about how every community within that Christian family has to be Jesus-centered. I am the vine, you are the branches, said Jesus. Now, the first thing we learn in Jesus' metaphor of the vine is that pruning happens. You'll see that I've made a first go at pruning this vine after last year. And I remember that this branch here, for example, although it grew very strongly, it didn't actually produce any fruit. There were no grapes on this shoot. No point in leaving it for another time. If it's not going to fruit, it's not going to fruit. So this comes off. And we take it completely out of the vine. Well, that seems fair enough, doesn't it? If it's not doing its job, we'll take it out. But what about these other shoots here? These are the ones which bore huge quantities of grapes last year. Nonetheless, they've had to be cut right back into the vine, because if you let them get long and straggly, and perhaps this one's a bit too long, then they break and again they're no use. Cutting them back actually encourages them to fruit. So whether you're a rather useless shoot that looks great, lots of growth but no fruit, that has to come off. And similarly, if you're producing good fruit, you still need to be trimmed back in order to encourage future growth. What's the interesting difference between this big shoot that's been taken off, which looks terribly impressive, and one of these little shoots here that's been trimmed back? Is this one has just got one future, and that's to shrivel up and die. This future, because it's still attached to the vine, is a future full of growth and fruit. And that's what Jesus was talking about when he talked about abiding. It's that connection. It's about taking your abundance, your life from Jesus, who is the vine itself. Anything taken away from the vine just is destined to shrivel up. It's these shoots, still attached, still abiding in the vine, that have a future. And what's important about that future, Jesus says, is fruitfulness, bearing fruit. Now, what might he mean by that? Abiding and fruiting. They're the two things that Jesus talks about in that gospel reading. Abiding and fruiting. And that's how we tell if ours is a Jesus-centered community. Those two words, it's a simple enough check, isn't it? Are we abiding in Jesus, and are we fruitful? Are we fruiting? What does abiding look like? Well, just as these branches have to be part of this strong, central vine, so we have to be part of the life of God, the life of Jesus. So a church that's abiding is making time to be with Jesus, to develop a relationship with Jesus, to come into the presence of Jesus and take delight and take our sustenance and our power from Jesus. All these things you could gather under a heading of prayer. So an abiding community, a Jesus-centered community, is first and foremost one that is a community at prayer, spending time in prayer with Jesus, learning about Jesus through reading the Bible together, and so on. A prayerful, abiding community. The second thing is fruitfulness. Now we might think, well, fruitfulness is all about growth, about replication, about reproduction. But of course, if you're a vine grower, as Jesus' hearers would have known very well, you don't reproduce a vine by planting grapes. That's not what the grapes are used for. If you want to reproduce a vine, you can very simply tuck a branch under the earth for a season and it will grow you a new vine. The grapes are about something quite different. The fruitfulness that Jesus talked about is about usefulness. Grapes are useful, they sustain us, they delight us. So a Jesus-centered community that's fruitful is a community that's useful, that's sustaining and nourishing the people around it. It's being good news in its community. Where we look at our church and find a church that is serving its community, nourishing them, feeding them with the good news of Jesus and God's love for them, then we know that they are being fruitful. Abiding and fruiting. They're the two sure signs of a Jesus-centered community. So I invite you just to reflect on our own Christian community here in Lymington and Pennington. The ways in which we abide. The ways in which we are fruitful. Or to use other words, how are we praying? How are we being useful? In these ways, we show that we are a Jesus-centered community.